it's the first two morning sessions were perfect for today. The debate about exports versus imports, domestic. Can India become less poor purely on domestic consumption? What is the impact of an Infosys job on Swiggy jobs? Is an $80,000 create 30, 40 of them? I mean, for a long time I used to fight with my mother, right? She used to say, usko achhi naukri mil gayi, multinational ke liye kaam karta hai. And I was like, are you a racist? Your son is an Indian entrepreneur. But in her mind, multinationals were a proxy for high wages by high productivity firms. That was just her proxy. And now she shifted, usko achhi naukri mil gayi, IT or pharma mein kaam karta hai, right? So I think all of us have this, and that's why Arvind's point about good jobs being wages, at least, is a battle that I've been trying to, in my undoctored PhD way, from my vantage point in labor markets, where we've hired somebody every 5 minutes for 20 years, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. And they didn't have a birth defect. They went to the college that they were told. And so now my sort of pet theme is, there's no such thing as poor people. They are people in poor places. And these 5 places aren't only geographic. So there are poor states, there are poor cities, there are poor sectors, there are poor firms, and there are poor skills. Karnataka and UP have the same GDP, but Karnataka does it with 1/4 the number of people. If you take cities, if everybody in India lived in Bangalore, then India's GDP would be equal to China. Because our per capita in Bangalore is now $11,000, India is $2,000. If you take sectors, IT is a rounding error for labor markets. It's 0.8% of the labor market, but it generates 8% of GDP. Agriculture is 40% of the labor market. It only generates 16% of GDP. And if you take firms, among my own clients, or we just did if you rank manufacturing companies by size, there's a 24 times difference in productivity. So if you're 24 times less productive, you'll never pay the wage premium. If you don't pay the wage premium, you'll never be productive, which is why 63 million enterprises in India only translate to 23,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So out of our 63 million enterprises, 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million pay GST, only 1 million pay Provident Fund. And obviously skills, within the same kid with the same paper qualification, I pay 4 times different salary. Feet on street liability. For one of my clients, in financial services, I'll pay 30,000 rupees. For another one, I'll pay 12. But retail floor supervisor, I may 45,000 for Bose, and I'll pay 8,000 for Reliance. So the panel here is sort of rich experience in different aspects of it, and I didn't want to give them a pre-agreed sort of presentation. I know Rana has one, and we'll figure out whether we do it. But I just wanted to ask everybody sort of questions related to their domain, and Rajesh has to leave earlier, so I'm going to start with him and then come to all of you. All of you have different vantage points, and that would be most interesting. Rajesh, do you think that supply can create its own demand? I live in Bangalore. The deregulation of the engineering colleges in the 1980s was done by politicians for different reasons. But that is one reason, and I'm happy to elaborate for people because I've spent time talking to Texas Instruments, IBM, and all the companies who really led to whatever that virtuous cycle was. So because you had so many engineering colleges, which North India didn't do, you went to IIT. But there was a cluster developed in Hyderabad, and which was a consequent to supply. But our overall experience in skill development, at least many of us, and we've talked about it, is we need the wage premium. If you tell us the wage premium, we can produce the people. So overall, the sort of theme of this, of higher wages, formal jobs, and sort of higher productivity, what is your sense of this dance between demand and supply? And just as Ministry of Skill Development, are you going to be able to do this without a Ministry of Employment getting its act together?
It's on. So first I must admit that Manish has put me in a tight spot. I came as an audience just to listen to others. He started with the rapid fire round. So what we say is that supply in some cases does attract investment. It per se does not create demand. Demand is a factor of many things, including how the economy is doing in general. But if we create a supply of good particular skill at a point, it can attract investments. For example, in warehousing, we see that companies look for where those clusters are, where they find skilled manpower and so on. So we do see that factor. And a few other factors also. So let him ask 1-2 questions, then I will get my thoughts together. So
okay, Sanjeev, do you think formal jobs, the theme of the panel was formal jobs, higher wages, and larger firms. Do you think they're the same thing today? And they may need not be in the future. We must have high productivity, small firms. But is today's formal jobs, higher wages, and larger firms the same thing?
Well, not always, but I will contrast it with the opposite thinking process, which had till very, very recently pervaded our policy making thinking, which was that somehow we needed to protect MSMEs, and they were at perpetual loggerheads with large companies, completely ignoring the fact that the reason you want MSMEs is because you want an ecosystem out of which occasionally some very large companies will pop out, or because the MSMEs are suppliers or demanders of services from or goods from large companies. In fact, much of the relationship between small companies and large companies is not one of competition but of collaboration. Even in a sector where they may be competing against each other, let's say retail, the small shop may be competing with Amazon or Flipkart, but the product it is selling is made by Procter & Gamble and Unilever. So this inbuilt quasi-socialist idea, small good, large bad, that was embedded in a lot of our thinking process, which we have to some extent begun to unwind. The PLI scheme is a very good example. It's been very successful and so on, but the fact is, why wasn't it done earlier? Because it would have been impossible to have done it with that mindset. Because effectively it is encouraging somebody to scale up and paying them to scale up, which was against the view that you had to somehow penalize people for scaling up and creating jobs. So I think this is an important intellectual breakthrough in the sort of hardware and software of the policymaker. And in the same strain, we have this issue of informality, which was sometimes eulogized, and sometimes by virtue of the fact that you overtax the formal by having very, very complex labor laws or taxing them in various ways and so on. And so, therefore, you advertently or inadvertently, you created an environment where informality was celebrated. Sometimes it was celebrated by virtue of the fact that you didn't pay taxes. Now, again, you can see the policy framework has changed, GST being a very good example of this, where there is a premium to being inside the formal system. And of course, people are coming in voluntarily. Look at the GST collections, not just the GST collections, we are seeing record collections of direct taxes as well through 2 years of very difficult times. So the point I'm making is the framework was set up in order for you to remain small, informal, outside the system, and in many ways that was celebrated. Now you move into a system, okay, even if you're small, you want to be a startup that wants to be a unicorn. So clearly a very different mindset from one which said, oh my God, if you're going to have more than 100 workers, we're going to come after you and check you and send inspectors to check whether your factory has buckets of sand in it or not. So I think that is the real turning point in our policy, debate, intellectual space, academia, etc. That shift is what I think is the big thing.
So Rana, you had some great research in the past. As an entrepreneur, I know that because there are two kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. My first company was a dwarf. It was a 50 crore company. My next company is, 5,000-8,000 crores, and it was a baby. You had a paper which sort of, why is India a nation of dwarfs, is what I got out of that paper. And you explained and you also said that productivity almost always seemed linked to size. Do you still agree with that? It's on.
It's on. Yeah. So Manish, I do. And I think many of those old relationships still hold. I don't know how much, this thing about new technologies is going to change that. Maybe at the margin, okay, you can reach out better to the outside world at smaller scales. But, at the scales which are relevant in India.
Your mic's not on?
At the scales which are probably relevant to the Indian debate, right? When you see this mass of firms, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 employees, and probably if you try to think of what they're doing, I think the issue still holds. The one change in my thinking has just really been this importance of cities. I prepared those slides, which this format doesn't allow. But and the reason I prepared those slides was that each of the 3 questions you put to us: larger firms, more formal jobs, higher wages. When you take the PLFS data and you compare rural, urban, of course, the urban sector is where these are. But the PLFS data allows you also to break cities, urban areas, down into cities with 1.5 million people or more in 2011 versus the others. You see the same relationships. You see wages are higher. You see more regular wage employment. Finally, you see more people working in big firms. And in fact, when you move over to wages, this issue of gender bias, it's very interesting. The female premium, yes, is negative, it's large, but it starts going down. You go from rural India to urban India, that premium to being a male falls. You go from small city to large city, the premium falls. Now, I know, these are cross-sectional regressions. There must be all sorts of sample selection effects. But at a first-order level, I think how we manage our cities and the peri-urban areas is really critical. Because ultimately, cities are the places where, the types of firms we want in manufacturing and services, they're going to be either in cities or peri-urban areas. And how these places are managed is critical. So for me, the big evolution in my own thinking has been the realization that our cities need to be managed in much better ways. I'll just say one more thing. I've been, it's this issue of when we look at our economic visions put together by our state industry departments, I've been struck by how little connect there is with the city or the peri-urban areas. What that basically means that if you're worried about things like connectivity, if you're worried about urban bylaws being met by your industrial parks, etc., it's just not coordinated. If you look at it, any firm to thrive needs a whole set of publicly provided inputs. And these publicly provided inputs, if they're going to be given to you by central government agencies, state government agencies, local government agencies, and they're not coordinating, we really have a problem. So I think that's the biggest evolution in my own thinking. All those things remain important. How you get it, I think city management, in India, we've got this great livability agenda. It's focusing on water supply, sanitation, etc. And I think we need another agenda, which is really to make the city as a locus of thinking about how to get those publicly inputs to the firm.
Okay, so I'll come to can you take jobs to people and people to jobs as the next round, but I wanted to give Radhicka a chance. I have, to me, informality, as I'm sort of in Sanjeev's camp, that informality is a sense of humor about the rule of law. People like us who choose to follow it get screwed because we're at a 40% disadvantage relative to people who do regulatory arbitrage. Because you can't comply with 100% of India's labor laws without violating 10% of them. I've heard you defend informality sometimes, maybe as a band-aid, maybe as an interim solution, and maybe you can elaborate, or maybe you don't defend informality. But my sense of when we've had conversations, you felt that this was a shock absorber. You felt that this is the hand we've been dealt. Maybe that's what it is. But are we wrong in our proxy for informality being a sense of humor about the law, in a sense, in a low productivity place?
So, well, I've not tried to defend informality. What I've tried to highlight is what are the drivers of informality. And of course, one of the key drivers of informality is what you're talking about. And a lot of firms are in the informal sector because they're trying to avoid certain regulations, they're trying to avoid paying taxes. But in the Indian case, a lot of people are in the informal sector, especially working in own account enterprises, which account for about 85% of all enterprises in India, because there actually aren't enough formal good jobs. People can't afford to remain unemployed. And because they can't afford to remain unemployed, they invariably do all kinds of odd work to sustain themselves. And these own account enterprises, which are in the informal sector, essentially represent the survival efforts of underemployed labor. And these are subsistence enterprises. So, what I'm saying is that it's not as if these need to be protected. In fact, I don't think they should be protected at all, which is what I was going to talk about in this discussion on larger firms and higher wages and formal jobs. Because our MSME policy, as Sanjeev mentioned, has been a lot about, we say MSMEs are the backbone of Indian industry. We give them a lot of policy support. But the nature of that policy support invariably is such that we actually incentivize them to remain small. We say, you get these benefits if you're below a certain threshold. Or you end up subsidizing these subsistence entrepreneurs or the very small micro enterprises, which cannot actually be engines of productive job creation, which use inefficient modes of production, and therefore we inadvertently end up penalizing the medium and large size firms, especially the firms which are, the constrained gazelles in the MSME sector, and are very often held back by policy fixable constraints. So I would definitely not defend informality, but I would say let's appreciate the heterogeneities in the informal sector, and having accelerating job creation in larger firms is absolutely imperative if you want to absorb the underemployed labor, which is largely in these own account enterprises, and create productive jobs for them. So the issue of actually higher wages and larger firms is at the heart of the challenge of productive job creation. And the fact that the firm landscape in India is completely dominated by small firms. About 95% of the firms, if you add all the firms in the formal and the informal sector, have just between 1 to 5 workers. And that's been referred to as the missing middle in the literature, where you basically just have a very large number of small firms, but the medium-sized firms are missing and the large firms are also missing. So that's what needs to be.
Why are they missing?
Why? Because most of them are essentially, the formal firms are not growing at a fast enough pace to create jobs for those.
Why?
Well, that's because of the usual suspects that you have, be it the infrastructure issues, be it the regulatory constraints on the labor side, the land side, the skills, the credit. And I think over and above that, I would also argue the fact that we haven't had an industrial policy in a long time is one big reason we've not been able to have large formal firms in India. And I think in that sense, the PLI is actually a very welcome development.
So do you want to just take a stab at the question, why doesn't India have as many large and productive firms as we should have had by now?
Well, there are certainly historical reasons for it, which we all know. We created a monstrosity of a license permit system. Those who had already crossed to the other side of the license permit system at whenever in the 50s, when this license permit system became pervasive, they remained well and nicely preserved. In fact, of course, they were the votaries of this, if you know, the Bombay plan. And so they were therefore consequently on the other side, they could continue, suffer some high taxes, but also therefore be pickled and preserved. And so it's only till the mid-90s which you begin to see new firms emerge. I mean, if the Indian business class between the 1940s and mid-90s is essentially the same, with the one addition of Reliance. Then from the 90s onwards, at least in the services sector, you begin to see new entrepreneurship begin to pop up. And that is now accelerating and accelerating. So while I agree from a cross-section perspective that this problem of dominance, but from a time series perspective, I would argue in the last few years, look at the explosion of new types of companies in all kinds of areas. So now what you're seeing is that process happening, and so your company like yourself or Oyo, for example, coming out of absolutely thin air and dramatically scaling up, that is now becoming, is gathering pace. And yes, the PLI is one thing, and we can do others as well. We're quite happy to hear out ideas of how to do this. But to some extent, you just have to allow time to permit. Meanwhile, you have to allow the insolvency and bankruptcy code to work, so that also spaces is created in the system for the inefficient bits of the old economy to die, so that these new companies emerging out of the MSME space can scale up. So this whole thing is about creative destruction in the end, and agglomeration effects and all these kind of things. So if that is what this is about, then you have to allow that process to happen for a little while.
So, Rajesh said, in a democracy, we would want equitable development across the country. But as as Rana also suggested, cities, so you can't take jobs to people, you have to take people to jobs. Is that a way to accelerate our productivity, wages at larger firms, or we're going to be able to take jobs to Bihar or because Kerala is now 9% Bihari, Tamil Nadu is now 6% Bihari, and I don't think Bihar should be proud of that, but that may be one way to solve the problem. But I just wanted to get your take from a skill, and even in your earlier avatars you've dealt with this. We have this dream of we'll take jobs to people. Is that a dream worth sustaining, or is it a dream which should die and we conclude we'll take people to jobs?
Very interesting question, and within our ministry last 3-4 months we are having a very intense debate on it, because the data seems to suggest that whenever we are skilling people, and we do skill people in rural areas, urban areas, but many of them ultimately migrate to urban areas. So that's where the jobs are, and we obviously know which are the job magnets. For example, Gujarat attracts millions of people from other states, and so on. There are clusters. So in the skill ministry, should we keep spending money for this kind of migration, or should we also be focusing on maybe slightly lesser productive jobs, but where let us say we try to grow the GDP of the villages? I don't know. In our ministry, we are having an intense debate that should we also focus on creating jobs or skilling for jobs where kids remain in the village only, and you are a votary of it that a 6,000 rupees job in a village is probably better than 10,000 rupees job 200 kilometers away, or maybe 20,000 rupees job 2,000 kilometers away. So that's a debate we are having, and we are quite ambivalent about it, and so we'll be experimenting on this. But the fact is that urbanization will grow, the clusters will grow, and the jobs will migrate from certain villages, certain tier 2, tier 3 cities to bigger centers.
Rana, you want to pick up on that? I mean, India has 6 lakh villages. 2 lakh of those villages have less than 200 people. So we won't be able to take a job with 200 people. So is that problem we only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people? Or what? When you said cities, are you talking not quantity, you're saying quality of urbanization? Is that?
Yeah, I hope it's open this time.
Now
So I think, the reality is agglomeration economies are real. I think we see that in India. We've done some work at a very high end, just looking at this issue of firms. So World Bank Enterprise Survey data, they gave it to us. They G-coded it with a plus minus 2 kilometer fudge. We mapped onto it a whole bunch of things like characteristics of cities, and you find firms located in these cities. With top-ranked universities, interestingly, top-ranked engineering departments are the ones who are introducing product innovations, process innovations, R&D. So I think at the top level, there's no contest. Agglomeration economies are important. I think even at the lower ends, I mean, if you can just manage to get a job in a bigger city, you're better off. So I think we have this reality that there are agglomeration economies, and I think trying to fight against the fact that economies of scale are a reality, which I completely agree with Sanjeev's point that the previous, we've been just guided for so long by this disregard for comparative advantage, disregard for economies of scale, and I'll just add agglomeration economies to this list. So we can't ignore it. At the same time, I do recognize that These processes take time, and there is a political economy challenge. I just wonder if, when we're designing these schemes from the different ministries, whether it's helpful to just break them up and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do for a social protection kind of reason, and this is what I'm going to do for an efficiency kind of reason. And in that sense, I completely agree. The PLI is nice because it's basically allowing that scale issue. So, Manish, that would be my response. I think the reality is, you will need to have these different schemes, the one village, one product, etc. But let's just be clear that there's a set of schemes for efficiency. We need those, and some schemes we're doing for social protection. Yes, we do those, but we're clear about what we're going to get from them.
So, Radhicka, 150, 200 million people buy a train ticket on Chinese New Year and go home. We don't have that on Chhat, Diwali, Eid, or Christmas, right? I mean, maybe in Chhat we have 10 million people buying a ticket. I've tried to estimate these numbers, but it's nothing in the range of 200 million. So you think 20 years from now, 200 million will buy a train ticket in South and West India and go to North and East home?
Well, I think that's a tricky question to answer, because I think that'll eventually boil down to how industry will evolve across states of India, across different regions of India. And if you look at the patterns and trends over time, what you see is that there is fairly strong industrial concentration, because the states which have traditionally done well in the industrial sector are those which are continuing to do well. The states where you have these sort of good jobs, where you have the better paying jobs, the formal jobs in the larger firms, the states which have a larger share of employment in larger firms are basically still states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Haryana. And over the last 15 years, the share of employment in larger firms in these states has gone up even more. So to the extent that those trends in industrial concentration are still very prevalent, I would say that they will continue to be the magnets of job creation.
Sanjeev, you think so too?
Well, answering your first point about Chinese New Year and Diwali, there is one structural reason why it won't happen.
Okay.
You see, Chinese society has one really big festival.
Yes.
We have several other.
So no, I didn't say two.
So I'm just saying
20 million versus 200.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying that it allows one reason why it doesn't happen. But anyway, the point is about agglomeration. And here, whether you are seeing cities or large firms, whatever you're talking, it's in the end about the same thing, which is the economies of scale and agglomeration that will happen. Now, in this context, and this is just a question, others may have some interesting answers. One is to simply create the infrastructure in large parts of the country so that this thing can filter. And it is happening in some interesting ways. For example, infrastructure is now popping up of good quality infrastructure in places which had never seen such things. For example, just yesterday, Deoghar, now it's a city many of people in this room may not even have heard of, now has a top-notch airport. It's got all kinds of it's got a new AIIMS there. Gorakhpur has a very nice airport, AIIMS and all kinds of other things. Same thing with Agartala has a very nice airport and so on. And this is also happening when, of course, we are putting through various internet is available, 5G is going to be rolled out. So in some ways, as you create clusters of infrastructure that allow this agglomeration to happen in a disaggregated way, I think you may not necessarily see it all becoming only Mumbai, Delhi. So that there is some dispersal in that sense that may happen. But agglomeration is still happening. It's just that maybe new geographically disaggregated agglomeration may be possible in a different way. But this does not get away from the point that you're still needing a sort of an agglomeration happening. So what I'm trying to get to here is that there is no escaping agglomeration. The reason people dislike agglomeration is because they see it as some sort of physical concentration or pressure on a few nodes. And my view is that it is possible to, at least to some extent, to kind of widen it out if you provide the relevant amount of infrastructure, etc., nodes in other places. And then pricing will take care of the rest. I mean, if you can do something at quarter of the price in Gorakhpur than you can in Mumbai, then so be it.
I mean, I agree with you. First 10 years of our company, we had employees only in 200 cities. As of this morning, we have 5,400 cities we have employees in. In the last 10 years is when that change has happened. But I know I have to let Rajesh go. So, Rajesh, do you want to respond to the broader point? And just should the Ministry of Skills think about skills? How should it, you don't know where the jobs are going to be. You don't know which firms are. It would be great to hear how are you trying to. This is a puzzle with a few pieces missing. I'm not putting you on a spot. I know how difficult it is to predict where jobs are. You're the waiter. You're not the chef. The chef is somebody else, and then you're hopefully filling that up. But how are you thinking about which skills, which regions, which firms that you should be targeting so that we get higher wages? Forget about bigger firms or formal firms.
Okay, let me talk about it from kids' point of view. We say that software is eating the world, and we see that in the skill sector. Every kid, not only in India but globally, they just want a computer job. And we see that in engineering colleges, only computer seats are getting filled up. No one wants to go into other streams. And those who land in other streams ultimately want a job in the IT side. So that's one that has a very detrimental effect on all other kind of skills. That's one point. And in our country, which is peculiar here, though not in the developed world, is that many jobs which are well paying, either as a self-employment or in formal sector also, they're non-aspirational. For example, a big question is a plumber or a AC guy earning 40,000-50,000 rupees a month. He's at a socially very low level compared to data entry operator sitting before a computer and earning 12,000 rupees. So this is something, as a society, I'm slightly despondent on this, that for many next years, this trend will continue. I don't see a quick break on this. So one, everyone wants an IT job. Second, non-aspirational, well-paying but non-aspirational job roles. I think those are two big issues.
So how will you get people to do to aspire for non-IT, chemical, civil? I mean, there'll be millions of those jobs. Are you saying the wage premiums are not attractive? It's just the fact that the wage premium in IT is so high that how will you compete with that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, on the bigger wages part, though sometimes one can argue that market dynamics will play, and if not enough people are available in chemical plants, then obviously the salaries will go up, but that's somehow not happening. And lower wages side, I told you about the non-aspirational part. So we don't have immediate answers or solutions visible to these two issues.
And what about the regional differences? I mean, more people will die in Karnataka in the next 10 years than be born. I mean, Kerala has already had that for a while, but that's obviously not true for many parts of India. So how does this regional is migration the future of India?
Yeah, it is, but as we were talking that Gorakhpur, Devgarh, Patna, they are developing. So maybe we will see lesser migration from a village near Patna to, let us say, Mumbai, but the guy might migrate to Patna. But people will be migrating out of their villages, out of smaller cities.
So if you can't take jobs to people and have to take, can you take skills to people? Is that the strategy where before they migrate? Because we notice that if the kid is skilled before he or she migrates, the wage premium is you land on the third floor rather than landing on the ground floor or as a security guard or a packer loader. And if you land on the third floor, then your migration wages are your trajectory of wages is totally different. So could you skill people before they migrate? Could that just be the thing?
Many states are actually doing that experimentation. For example, if Nagaland knows that, let us say, 10,000 kids will migrate to Mumbai or Bangalore, so they have two choices. Let the kids get trained here for the job roles which are based in Mumbai and Bangalore. And then as a trained fellow, if you land in Bangalore or Mumbai, it's expected you don't have to spend money without a job and you start earning. But also the counter is that if Nagaland actually has set up training centers in Mumbai and Bangalore, they take untrained kids there, train them there 3 months, and then put them on the job. And there they say that kids staying in Mumbai, Bangalore, they become more confident in first 3 months. The first job they land up is slightly higher. So these are issues. So we are allowing both models to operate at the moment.
Okay. And just before I let you go, I know 2:45 you have a hard stop.
So it's real rapid fire.
No, just entrepreneurship. You're the Ministry of Skills and Entrepreneurship. And I worry about this dream of self-employment being a solution to India's wage problem, right? Because we already have 50% self-employment, that's self-exploitation. And most of it is self-exploitation. But do you think that's true?
That's more true in agriculture, where we see that self-employment is almost equal to sort of underemployment. But
So
in
how do you think of the
services
entrepreneurship
sector,
part of your management?
for example, the welders, plumbers, AC guys, these I see that self-employment is not really, some of them are running quite
It's
well,
not.
and they are quite happy. And within 1 or 2 years, they actually take in 1 or 2 sport kids, and in turn, after 2 years, they become
What
full-fledged
categories are these? Because it might relate to the non-tradable services paper. So that was presented in the morning, that because of traded services, non-tradable services. So you're saying services provided to the rich are seeing higher wages.
No, not really.
Hmm.
For example, beauty parlor role. Even in the villages with 400 population, we see the girls do
It's
start
viable.
making money. It's viable. So there are many job roles which are viable even in small villages. So, and I believe the earlier discussion on formal, informal, I believe we are colored sometimes by a perception of manufacturing sector. So the license Raj, the previous license Raj, that applied to more like manufacturing sector. In the services sector, in hotel industry or in many other industries, we see a whole range of businesses coming up, small and big. So in manufacturing that hits more, the license Raj hits more. in a sense.
Well, great. Thank you for
Thank you.
coming. Sorry.
I will listen to some more questions for 10 minutes, then.
Oh, you have to go.
Yeah.
Okay. I was okay with you being here. I was going to get Sam over. But do you want to jump in here, Sanjeev, on this question of tradable services being, we are more formal in services? Or we are higher productivity in services? Or none of that is true? This is irrelevant. Let's not focus on manufacturing services. Let's just focus on firm size and formality.
Yes, I think I wouldn't get too worked up about these distinctions anymore. I mean, of course, because of history, these restrictions, etc., applied more to manufacturing, which is why the services sector grew more. We sort of our economy basically became services-driven economy. Without going through the manufacturing phase, we are trying to retrofit it now. If it succeeds, we'll see. But it is true that these restrictions were more binding on the manufacturing sector, which is why the services sector grew so fast. Now, historically, services were not really tradable. That is what I think is the real change that has happened. Since the very late 90s, but more through the 2000s and the last decade or so, increasingly services have become more and more tradable in multiple ways. In fact, manufacturing itself, the value addition is now increasingly in the services end of it, i.e. the design part of it. The actual act of manufacturing is very often quite trivial. So in that environment, and I think what you are beginning to see is that, yes, you will also see a more hybrid universe that, for example, gig jobs. Is that formal or is it informal? And so on. So I think maybe also we need to take into account increasingly that the whole thing is much more fuzzy. So while for academic discussions we may like to have a nice boxes, those boxes are themselves arbitrary boxes and continuously evolving. I think the real game now is to make sure, rather than try to predict how this is going to evolve, which we can't predict the skills, we can't predict the kinds of jobs, we can't predict the kinds of firms that will be and what mix of services, manufacturing, etc. it's going to be. Why bother? What we need is simply that having a flexible system that allows agglomeration in whichever way. It could be a bunch of gig economists, sort of workers coming together on the internet to do something together for whatever reason. That's also agglomeration. So I think the job as a policymaker is not try to guess how this is going to pan out, but to create a system that is flexible and resilient and allows for financing to happen and allows the creative destruction process to also take place.
If you want to respond to him, otherwise
Can I
I'll open it up.
just
Yeah,
say
please.
one
If
thing?
either of you want to respond, otherwise we'll open it up.
So So in this discussion of formality and informality, I think it's important that we make the distinction between an enterprise being formal or informal and a job being formal or informal, because they're very different things, and the trends on those are also different. Because if you look, be it within the manufacturing sector or you look at the economy as a whole using PLFS data, what you find is that the size of the informal sector, the share of employment in the informal sector has declined, and quite substantially so since 1999-2000 till 2018-19. Of course, there's been a slight increase post-pandemic, which is only expected. But while we have seen a decline in the share of employment in the informal sector and an increase in the share of employment in the formal sector, what we are seeing is that within the informal sector, there is more informalization of employment which is happening. And so on aggregate, when you aggregate the enterprise-based concept of informality and the job-based definition of informality, you actually see no change in the share of informal employment in India over time, despite a shrinking share of the informal sector. Even if you look at the share of informal employment in the formal sector in India from 1999-2000 to about 2017-18, that's gone up from almost 40% to 50%. I'm talking about within the formal sector. So I think the notion of what a formal job is, we'll also need to think through what that is with the new code on the labor codes as well. The idea of this permanent job may not be something that we will see very much in the years to come, and the notion of formality may be based on the concept of fixed-term contracts, which have now been introduced. So the idea of a formal job may also change.
You want to respond? Or?
Just one thing on the skills one, which is that I think it's useful to think of skills. You have foundational skills, which you get really in school, primary school, etc. You have sector-specific skills, firm-specific skills, and I think when at ADB when we started when the skills development program started taking off in 2010, etc. One of the things we realized was that kids were coming in with such weak foundational skills that I remember many of these skill centers had to do what they called repair. Forget trying to teach welding. You actually need to really just get down to some really basics of numeracy, etc. So just in this discussion, it's good not to forget the importance of improving learning outcomes in Indian schools. My sense is, once you do that and once you get these large firms going, let them handle it. I mean, McDonald's had come up in some, I think Dilip had mentioned McDonald's, but it reminds me, I think Nick Bloom had made this point that look at McDonald's. It's actually a very efficiently run chain of restaurants. And they take very average workers and they've figured out how to really make these workers work extremely efficiently. In fact, I remember in a SEZ in the South, I got the chance to visit this toy factory. They had photographs. They had photographs of good stitches, bad stitches, etc. So sometimes I think that the skills issue, we need to put more burden on firms. To get together now, the SEZ, I remember these guys got together, they started complaining they needed a skilling center to be provided by the developer, and I remember one of my colleagues said, why can't your 100 firms just get together and put together a center? So sometimes I think the firms we need to put more, let them do it. They want firm-specific skills, or very narrowly defined skills, let them do it. We've got to focus on the foundational part.
I mean, it's hard for companies to manufacture their own employees, but we can talk about that separately. I mean, you can repair people, but you can't prepare them. So what you're calling repair is actually ends up being prepare, but I agree with you. We need to figure out a way how to align the financing incentives. But if anybody has questions, yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question on the why there are not enough large firms. And since Robert Lawrence is here, he made this very important point in an earlier session about the role of demand. I wonder if there's enough discussion or understanding of what the impact is coming from insufficient demand for high quality products, which typically bigger firms provide. And if that is indeed a bigger factor, then maybe the one way to get bigger firms is to actually have agriculture productivity improve and raise incomes, and not just a story on the labor side and the labor reform side. So. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Do we
You both, either of you.
Radhicka wants to go.
Sam?
Okay.
Where is Sam?
Oh, do we come in?
Please come. Can you give me?
Radhicka, where do you go?
You go one, either of you. It's a
Okay.
above my pay grade question.
I think that that's an excellent point, and it's something which is really underappreciated in the discourse in India, because when we analyze industrial performance, the entire focus is on supply side factors. The demand side factors are exceedingly important. The fact that we say, oh, we're such a large country, but where is the domestic demand? The domestic demand is not there because agricultural productivity and agricultural wages are not high enough to actually create the demand that you need for high quality manufacturing goods, which is why if we're not able to generate that domestic demand, we need to be more export oriented. But even there, we have not been so focused. So yes, the demand factor is extremely important.
Well, demand is important, but I will dispute one thing, that somehow large firms make products which are for richer people and small firms make it for poor
No,
people.
no,
I actually will
I don't
dispute
think
that.
so.
I mean,
Mr. Sanyal, I
basic
didn't
things
say
like
that. What I
shampoo or
said-
soap, etc., are produced by Unilever.
No, I don't think he was saying
The
that.
point, the regularity is bigger firms tend to produce products that are higher quality. Smaller firms tend to produce products that are low. It's not about rich or poor. It's about quality.
Yes, I mean, that's part of the point about agglomeration and so on. Anyway, there is a different point that I wanted to make, which is that I think one of the real problems India had was that India was a large country, but not a large market. That's not just because India's GDP was relatively smaller. The real problem was that we were divided up into a large number of local markets. It was easier till you introduced GST for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than for Mumbai to trade with Delhi. So one of the things that has really happened in the last 3-4 years is that GST has created a unified common market that allows scale to take advantage of the very point that you are making. So it is now that we can have these grand scaling ups and take advantage of the market. Otherwise, Maharashtra is a small market. That's how it is. And Tripura has no chance because it's just too small a market. So I think the unification of the market through GST to the unification of market through better infrastructure. I mean, the highways and railways and airports, all of them being upgraded. So as with everything else, the system of creating a virtuous cycle is what it's about. And I think we are reaching the tipping point where we maybe these things will begin to flow in our favor. Not only that, we have also now become much more aggressive about capturing markets and unapologetic about it as well. So whether it's in terms of going out and fighting for FTAs with various countries, we've just won one with Australia and UAE. We're probably going to sign one by end of the year with the UK and so on. So both the orientations outward and inward and looking at scale of markets, I think this is something we are doing. I'm not saying a finished job, but clearly we understand that this is an issue.
Yes, Ram. And then
Sanjeev and Rana seem to be suggesting by their arguments that if there is a demand for high productivity, high paying jobs, the supply side will take care of it. That doesn't seem to be happening. The constant refrain from corporate sector, from industry is that there is a shortage of adequate skilled workforce. And it's not only vis-a-vis formal sector. In the informal sector also, we struggle to find good electrician, good plumber. Even in a room like this, I will be surprised if you sequence the lights and the switches that you use to switch them on, if there's a matching, 1-on-1 matching. So it's the problem is so pervasive that whether you look at formal sector, formal employment, or informal, there is not a good matching. The supply side doesn't seem to be supplying. Supply side doesn't seem to be catering to the demand. Part of the problem, in my view, is unemployment. When unemployment is high, then the sorting through market becomes very difficult. But the most serious challenge is that we do not have good understanding of how to skill our workforce.
We
through
shouldn't
the
have
entire
let him. We shouldn't have
spectrum.
let him go, but you should have asked that
So
before.
perhaps, you know,
Does
so-
anybody want to take a stab?
Yeah.
We agree.
So
I agree with you.
even with respect to, you know, the Radhika's point about self-employment, people who are employed, there is very bad sorting even there, because that's a residual category. So we need to have a good matching even within the self-employed, you know, employed sector or categories also.
You wanted to jump
And
in?
that, you know, without addressing these two issues, which is unemployment and the skilling of workforce, it's difficult, but I don't have a good understanding how to go about it.
So I have a somewhat, I hear this a lot, but I have a somewhat radical view on this matter. I hear this a lot in the sense that there is embedded in this argument is the idea that we have to first fix our education system and skilling, and then it will lead on to people then doing things. Whereas, in fact, the electricians that you find in most of the other countries come from the same village. You go to Dubai, the lights are put in the right places. It's done by the cousin of the same fellow from the same village in Muradabad. So he wasn't higher skilled when he turned up there. So why is he able to do it there and not here? So it has got a lot to do with the general culture of excellence that is a problem in this country, which may not be a skills problem. It may be a different problem.
You want to?
Yeah, I'll speculate. I think it's the contracts. So I've observed this thing. For example, driving from Colombo to a city, and you just look at the quality of construction, seems to be much better. So I asked one of our civil engineers who does projects in South Asia, what's going on? And he said, look, when the government is just much more demanding of the quality of infrastructure. Period. They're just willing to pay more for quality. So when your contract allows for that, then the contractors just provide for it. But if you're going to go absolutely rock bottom on everything, L1, etc., you are going to get low quality. And I think these big public sector projects they have a very important role in how they actually get the skills generated, etc. Second, again, just pure observation. I don't know. I think there's something to it. You know, I've lived 15, 16 years in Manila. You deal with the informal sector, it's exactly the same. There'll be some great names that all of us are sharing. Oh, you know, electrician, call this guy, don't call this guy. I think it's the same. When it comes to the formal sector, you see these big multinational firms who are out there, who are building these skyscrapers, who are taking care of the highways, etc. So I do think, you know, the contracts, and I think allowing in some foreign direct investment, I don't know, frankly, about this sector, but it has always puzzled me. You know, when I just look at the quality of just the bypasses, etc., it's hugely different. I suspect that's where you're.
Actually, let me add one more thing to it. Absolutely agree in the contracts, but the contracts themselves are a problem because of a mindset. After all those fancy buildings in Singapore and Dubai are built not only by Indian workers, very often by Indian companies like L&T. So why is it that they aren't building them here? Because of this whole mindset of L1. And forget about going and building some new buildings. Look at when we are trying to demolish awful buildings like Shastri Bhavan and putting a decent building up. There are howls of protest from the elite of this country. Why are you doing this?
Okay. So Arvind, Sonal, and then Sujit, if anybody else has their hand. You also have Arvind.
Certainly, a lot to be said for what Rana said. You know, I mean, after all, BlackRock has been actually maintaining some of the buildings in Mumbai and some of the other bigger cities, and those are quite different, you know. So certainly, you know, willingness to pay and go to the top. So then good things can happen anywhere. But I want to get back to this whole issue of, you know, agricultural productivity first and the demand problem and so forth. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the issue of efficiency. First of all, in agriculture itself, with 48% of your land holdings also being these tiny little holdings, less than half hectare with an average size of less than a quarter hectare, how the hell are you expecting productivity to rise? So that's not where you can break this vicious cycle. Ultimately, and the demand issue, are you efficient? If you're efficient, go. There is a whole global market, you know, $28 trillion worth of global marketplace. So ultimately, it comes down to the efficiency. and you're going to break the cycle only through exporting of goods and services. I think that's where you have to really get efficient. And that does come back to, a skilling problem as being one of the problems. It's not the only one. Likewise, also, I think, Rana, earlier on, you didn't come to your big theme of what I use everywhere. I mean, your results, but I use them everywhere. Where you started, Manish, the firm size. When you look at, China, where about 50% of the workforce is in large firms, large as in 200 workers or more, about 25% in medium-sized firms, about 50 to 199, and then less than 50 is small. So you got about 75% in these medium and large firms. In India, 85% in small, and just 15% between the medium and large. And you look at the wage structure, the wages, or at least average productivity. I think what you have is the average labor productivity rather than not the wages. The average labor productivity in the small firms in China is about 60% of what it is in the large firms. In India, it's just 20%. Now, what that is telling you, to me at least, is that when 75% of the workforce is in medium and large firms, it is those firms that are defining the ecosystem in the marketplace. The labor market tightens up for the small firms also, so they have to shape up. But when you got 85% in small and just 15% between medium and large, the ecosystem is defined by these small firms. Labor market has a lot of slack. Nobody has any interest in enforcing efficiency, and competition in the labor market is just missing. So I think that is really, truly the major problems. Ultimately, it does go back, at least in my thinking, the size of the firm is critical.
You want to?
Yeah. Let me come in because I completely agree with Arvind's point on agriculture. I apologize to the people who were at this Niti Aayog seminar that Professor Lawrence did the other day because I made this same point. But we should do everything possible to increase agricultural productivity. But if you look around the world at the difference between the most productive and or the richest countries and the poorest countries, huge differences in agricultural productivity. Generally speaking, the most productive countries these are the richest countries overall, but they're 50 times more productive per worker in agricultural output, just in sheer amount of wheat that each agricultural worker produces. Now, out of that 50x, 25x is coming from just the size of the land that the worker is working, okay? So it's just a factor of 2, it's all the other factors. And I ask my students every time I start in a development class this exact question. So really, this problem of agricultural productivity, we should do all those things, but never expect it to drive absolutely massive growth, because mostly the challenge in agriculture is that there are not enough jobs outside of agriculture that would draw people off of the farms. And the small farm sizes are a reflection of the fact that there isn't enough labor demand in other sectors that's holding things down. I've done a series of papers on rural development and looking at really, really big investments in rural areas and what those might lead to. You build roads from PMGSY into rural areas, you build massive irrigation canals, and what we see over and over again in my work and others is that you invest in rural areas and not that much changes. That wages don't change, that jobs don't change. And so I really think this comes back to Rana's point about agglomeration economies, that India doesn't need to come up with new strategies for what makes people productive. We know what makes people productive. Educated people in cities are really productive. And that's true in Delhi, and that's true in Bombay, and that's true in Bangalore, and that's true all over the country. And so I really think that a lot of the emphasis should be on why aren't India's cities growing faster? And I think part of that comes down to lots of barriers to migration that make it really, really difficult for people to move across space to access new opportunities. And part of it comes down to the fact that it's just incredibly difficult to build in India's cities. Developers want to put up more buildings, they want to put up bigger buildings. There's a lot of demand for urban real estate. You can see it in the real estate prices, but it's just too difficult. I think onerous zoning, really, really low floor area ratio restrictions. I mean, why aren't there world-class buildings like in Singapore and India? Because they're not allowed in most cities. Part of it is the demand story, but a lot of it is it's just straight up not allowed by regulation. So I think we need to take very seriously these questions of all of the frictions that are standing in the way of urban growth.
You want to respond? I mean, the only way to help farmers is to have less farmers.
Well, I mean,
He says.
if you ask farmers, they will tell you their children do not want to farm. So there is revealed preference on this matter. It's not a. I don't know why.
Everybody agrees.
So even the farmers agree.
Sonal and Surjit.
Rajesh Aggarwal talked about aspirations. Everybody wants to be in IT sector and not be a plumber. I think it's actually worse than that. Work that people have NCR have been doing, both parents and children, 75% want government jobs. It's not just that they want to be in IT. Everybody wants to be in a government job. A driver, if working for the government, gets paid 35,000. Somebody working for the private sector gets 15,000. So at some level, we have been talking about large and small employers, but we haven't talked about the largest employer in the country, the government, and its salaries, which have been continuously upgraded through various pay commissions. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, civil servants are 25 million people, right? I mean,
No, so let me answer this question. People don't want government jobs. They want basically high-paying, secure jobs. If you found them somewhere else, they will take it too. So the question is, is it possible for the government to create that level of high-paying jobs? And the answer is no, we can't employ the whole country. So we need to create, and this is precisely why the whole point of larger firms is concerned. They tend to be better paying, they tend to be more secure, and so on. So I don't think that the question is really
government
doesn't yeah. The
no,
question
but there is a wage
change.
premium. I think that's
There
the
is a
point.
wage premium,
Exactly.
and that wage premium is there. I mean, somebody working in Tata's also gets paid very well. It's a different matter. You may have a disagreement with whether the output they produce is commensurate to the amount they are paid, and that is a discussion for a long evening with a drink.
I mean, it's not just a wage premium. It's also the nature of the contract, right? If you look at this, 10% of people are formally employed, and that's a very relaxed definition of formality in India. If you actually say that, let's look at the share of people who are employed in jobs that offer them secure contracts and also provide them all available social security benefits, that number in India has never been more than 2 or 3% of total employment, and most of these jobs are really government jobs. So in that sense, for people who are really attaching a premium on security more than wages, a government job is the last resort, and that's why you see all these aspirants sitting for exams. I mean, you had 30% of India's youth is in the category of NEET, and they're basically sitting preparing for different sort of exams to get these secure jobs. Because today, given the increasing informalization and contractualization in the formal sector, the government is kind of the last resort of getting a good job if defined strictly.
Let me add here too. Even here at the margin, this is changing. So a generation ago, the top students in the country, we went to a very top university and asked the kids what they wanted to do. A very large proportion would have said they wanted to write the UPSC exam. I have been doing this regularly in IITs and other top institutions in the last couple of years. It has clearly changed toward doing other things. So a lot of them want to do startups, for example, especially in the engineering type fields. But there are people who want to do completely different things, become writers, sportsmen, and other things. So there is a clear shift from rent-seeking jobs to value creation jobs.
Okay. I was a goofy chair last time, so I want to make sure I finish on time. So Surjit, the gentleman there and the lady here, and then we'll just give them time to wrap up. And I'll give Sam some extra time because he's wrong on migration, equalization of wages.
Yeah, the whole discussion, very rich, and I think it mixes a lot of issues going on. And I want to start with that first and foremost, in terms of our perception and our expectation of where India should be going is shaped by not what India historically has been necessarily, but by the international environment, globalization, etc. So we want India, first of all, to be like the US, but that's too rich. Then we want India to be like China, not recognizing that they are about 3 times our per capita income. And then we've got nothing else to compare with. So I think, and we don't realize that in such a globalized world, there are forces beyond Indian forces. Now, I'll just mention 3 things. First, I want to completely agree with Sanjeev that a very important part of explaining our own past is our mindset, and our mindset was set by policies 30, 40, 50, 20 years ago. So that will not change. Our mindset is, so the globalization has changed our own mindset, everybody around this table, but it won't change the reality on the ground that quickly. So that, let's all be patient, it will happen. But let's recognize what's going on. Second, related to that, is this whole thing of government jobs. Now, we did a study with Tita Das on the 2017, and I think Radhicka knows about, we discussed it. Very interesting result from the 2017-18 PLFS. If you look at unemployment, unemployment is huge. Remember, that was a big story of the 2017-18 PLFS data, that unemployment has shot up to about 6% from about 2% before in 2011-12. Well, that very same data shows that people above 30, the unemployment rate stayed exactly the same, 1% or so. So that brings us to youth unemployment, which was the dominant feature of that. Now, outside of the US, youth unemployment is a problem. It's a mega problem. Go to any country, developed, not developed, youth unemployment is so what is going on? Why is youth unemployment everywhere in the world such a problem? There's been a massive expansion in education around the world, especially in developing countries. That has sent a flood of people to the marketplace. And they cannot all be absorbed at once in the high-paying jobs that parents sent their kids to school to study so they could get a government job or high-paying job, etc. So let's recognize these are international forces. We can't do anything about it, and we have to grow out of it. But to blame that, look, this should happen. It will not happen. Last on this education bit, that very same 2017-18 data on good jobs. So if you now look at salaried workers, and that's actually Radhicka 25%, and that I would say is at least formal, and there's much more, but I won't go into that separate debate. Salaried workers between 2011-12 and 2017-18, real wage did not go up. Let me emphasize, real wage did not go up. Non-salaried workers, which are called casual workers in the Indian parlance, their real wages went up at about 2% per annum. Relate this to education and aspiration and everything else, and I think the puzzle falls in place.
Okay. Yes, so you had a question, and if you just ask questions, that would be great at this stage.
So this is regarding the very first questions you raised, that whether people to job or job to people. So I think in current state, both should prevail, because in 2017, we did a migration survey from 3 high migrating states in India, and we followed up migrants. So there we find that a lot of migrants from these poorer high migrating states, they came to the urban neighborhoods, and they were employed in a much informal jobs, as we and which do not have. They were basically employed as a security guard in a housing society, or a domestic cook, a domestic help, like that, which do not have any job security, no social security benefits. If you go to the background of these people, so they are coming from the remote rural backgrounds, where we are not creating enough infrastructure to provide them basically skills, so that they can claim that they will go to the basically people to job. that approach is not working. So whoever are basically able to exercise that one, so they are able to get high paid jobs, well secured jobs. So until the point we are able to create enough opportunity, at least infrastructure to these people, so we should have both approaches, and we should focus more on the basically job to people approach, basically to extending jobs to the rural areas where we are not creating enough infrastructure. I think that may be more workforce, as more than 70% of the people live in the rural areas.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes ma'am.
Suppose we go into the future, do you think energy transitions are going to change things, because there would be formal sector, like big players like Ambani or Adani installing solar parks, wind parks in rural areas, and there would be smaller players, small scale firms who would be installing suppose rooftop solar panels. So is there going to be some change in the employment situation with energy transition?
Yeah, you could,
Quick clarification. I think Radhicka raised a very important point of who is informal. You know, whether you're working in the informal sector, jobs are informal. I remember there was a very nice study, National Statistical Commission 2004-05, which said that 95% of jobs in India are informal. I was wondering if there's an update of that and if there's been any movement in that, and even if it's gone down from 95 to whatever, even if it's at the margin, it would be good to know.
So it was 92% in that report, and that number is now at 90%.
I know lots of your questions. Only questions, no comments. Comments, you give your name to Poonam next time you come on the panel.
Question. Like the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor is about industrial infrastructure between Delhi and Mumbai, and considering that urbanization in Bihar is the lowest, is there any plan, whether from the government or from the economic fraternity, to create a Patna to Varanasi economic corridor along the DFC, where you just develop large cities so that you can soak up people closer to home rather than going to Kerala and becoming 9% of the population?
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Scream.
My question is, I'm linking two concepts here. That given the threat of climate change over the next few years, we might see differential distress migratory patterns. And the problem that Sam mentioned, that there are no jobs outside the agriculture sector, even if people want to move, that might actually get aggravated. Is the government considering anything on that front? I'm not sure whether there's any research on this, but I foresee this as a problem, if not 5 years from now, but 10 years from now.
Do you want to take some of the questions? Just random order, whichever one you'd like to answer.
Okay,
energy is a I'm not sure energy is a binding constraint, but they'll know more.
The problem is one of predicting exactly what will happen. Let's take whether it's the energy transition or whether it is exactly what will happen out of how exactly climate change will impact different parts of the country. Very impossible for me to predict. Therefore, the most important thing I can do is to remain flexible, respond fast to whatever is happening as they begin to happen. I don't think I can put in some ex ante, put in some policy on it as such, because I cannot predict exactly how it will be. I may know climate will change, but whether it will affect the coastlines of Kerala more than the rainfall in Bihar, I have no way of predicting. And having messed around a lot with a lot of these weather models, I can also tell you that they also do not really tell you exactly how it'll pan out. So there are many areas where responding quickly and flexibly count for more than our ability to predict better.
So I'll just come in on one quick point, which Professor Panagaria referred to, Rana's very famous paper, which looks at the employment distribution across firms of different sizes, and all the statistics that you pointed are true. But I think the good thing is that if you actually track this data over time, what we are finding is that in the manufacturing sector, the share of employment in medium and large size firms has increased quite substantially between 2000 and 2015-16. If you look at especially firms which are in the 250 plus category, their share in manufacturing employment has gone up from about 20% to 30%. So it's a little difficult to disentangle and look at firm life cycle dynamics given the nature of the annual survey of industries. But it appears that these results are being driven by the entry of new large firms or the or the fact that there are some dynamic SMEs that are moving up and expanding and transitioning to higher size bins. And what implications that has for policy is worth thinking about. How do you accelerate the entry of these new large firms, schemes like PLI, and how do you design MSME support for these constrained gazelles, who have the potential to grow but are very often held back by policy fixable constraints? How do you actually identify them? So there is some improvement which is happening there. It's all not that depressive.
Rana?
Okay.
Yeah, just a point, Salesh. I don't know about the Patna Varanasi, but I do know that, for example, like we at the ADB, we've been focusing on this East Coast corridor, right? The World Bank, I think, does have a Kolkata thing just heading
East-West corridor.
And one thing on this, I think as India's logistics infrastructure improves, the transport, and as PM Gati Shakti gets going, I think we're going to see some very interesting new centers start coming up. A study we did looking at industrial concentration in India using economic census data, we were so surprised. If you look at the aggregated state level studies, etc., everyone talks about concentration. Post 1991, but in fact what we found is actually things are dispersing, and very simple, our referees pushed us to have some policy section at the end, and they said, you can't just leave it like this. So we looked at simple correlations between a measure of transport connectivity and land availability. So it was a proxy measure, and the results very intuitive, at least to me. Better transport leads to more dispersion. I think that's a good thing. The bad one was land. So states in which you have cities with tighter urban bylaws on land are the ones where there's dispersion going. And it's the last thing I want to say. I want to connect it to work Rhythm has done, which really is, if my interpretation of Rhythm's work on Karnataka on these firms really was, I think labor laws, luckily we are moving right in the right direction. Maybe it's taking time for the notifications, etc. But land, this issue of how do you take this land, rezone it, etc., in a transparent way, quick way, responding to economics, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges.
Okay, I wanted to get you, and Sam, thanks for being a sport and stepping in halfway. So on two things. One was just your overall, the overall thesis that is accelerating formal jobs and higher wages and larger firms the same thing. My thesis is that, but obviously I myself never ask a barber if you want a haircut. What am I going to say?
Yeah.
But the other people also, and Arvind for a long time has been very important in my thinking about just larger firms. Let's focus on what's important. We need larger firms because they pay better wages, and they pay better wages because they're productive, because they have more access to capital or talent or technology. So that thesis. And the second one about, you saying that I asked a stupid question, do you take jobs to people or people to jobs? Because anyway, wages equalize, right?
Yeah.
So don't bother taking one to the other. They'll anyway equalize. Now, explain yourself on the second one. And first one, whatever broader comments you like.
Sure. Let me first just kind of second what Rana was saying about it. I think land and the efficient reallocation of land towards higher productivity uses being an absolutely massive issue, and I really hope to see more work on this and hopefully do some myself. On the question of are these the same, certainly I think the global evidence very much points in that direction. Larger firms, more formal jobs, and so on tend to and higher wages tend to go together. I guess I want to make a meta point, which is that, these are all symptoms of the diseases. Like, the problem is not that there aren't large firms, it's that there's something standing in the way of India's firms becoming large. And the work by Shea and Klenow and others show that India's firms tend to just stay very flat over time in a way that American firms and other firms don't. Other firms in other countries grow and keep on growing. Workers in firms in other countries, their wages keep on growing up. It looks like they get more and more productive over time. That doesn't seem to be nearly the case in India. And so I think when we're thinking about the problems, when we're thinking about the policies, we really want to be thinking about what are the binding constraints in the sort of Roderick and Hausman growth diagnostics framework. And the symptoms can point in those directions, but they're just our starting point. And so I think on the skills question, I think we're often coming at the problem too late. If people have gotten a terrible education, then you're going to have a hell of a hard time skilling them up. And, India's done an incredible job of getting more butts in seats. But as Lant Pritchett says, schooling ain't learning. And we have Karthik somewhere in the audience. There he is. So I just want to give a shout out to Karthik for all of his amazing work on improving the quality of schooling, but also identifying just how many students are so very far behind their grade level that like the actual schooling numbers can be very, very misleading about the quality of the workforce coming out.
Can I ask a question? Are you saying the school wage premium is higher than the skill wage premium, or it's too late if you don't do it in school?
No, I'm saying...
Because there is interesting stuff going on that since India's transition is not happening from farm to factory, it's happening from farm to sales.
Yeah.
And customer service and logistics. That's where India's farmers are going, unlike China where they went to factories.
Right.
The school wage premium might be higher than the skill wage premium, but you're saying it's a timing, it's too late. You have to fix schools, you can't do it in 3 months.
I mean, I'm all for pushing on all margins, but I think that you're going to have a hell of a hard time skilling people up if they haven't gotten an adequate education in their school. And I think there's a lot of evidence on that. On the question of migration, I don't think that your question was a silly one at all. I think that India has huge barriers to the movement of people across space. I was talking a little bit about cities and the difficulty of cities growing that are going to need to absorb people. I like to describe housing units in cities as like visas for migration. Like you can't possibly go from a low productivity rural area to a high productivity urban area if there isn't a housing unit for you. And same, like you can't come to the United States to get a job that pays much more than in Uganda if there isn't a visa for you. And so there's just like, we need far, far more housing in India's cities. Wages haven't equalized. The multiplier on wages from like the poorest states like Bihar to the richest states is a factor of 2.5. And in the US, so 250% difference between the poorest and the richest. In the US, it's just a factor of 50% difference between like Mississippi and Massachusetts or Connecticut. So what I think that points to is that there are much larger frictions to people moving and arbitraging these differences. Now, some of these are questions of language, some of these are cultural, but a lot of these are just that it's very difficult to move across space, and a lot of this is actually coming from policy. So I had when I found out an hour and a half ago that I was going to be on this panel, I asked my research assistants to quickly pull together some information on this that I remembered reading. There's a terrific group called India Migration Now, which is doing a lot of work on like the challenges that people face by moving across space. They're based out of Bombay, and one of the things that they've done is they've actually put together data on the kinds of requirements that it takes to become domiciled in a place and the benefits that you get from getting that. So in Gujarat, to take an example, you have to be resident for 10 years in order to be considered domicile, and only after that do you get access to various services. Do you get access to the PDS and other things? So I think it's terrific, actually. I know that portability of benefits has been a really major priority, and I think that that's going to take care of some of these issues, but like there are still a lot of other ones that are going to make it very difficult for people to move across space. On the issue of rural infrastructure, since this is an area that I've worked on a lot, and whether jobs are going to go to people or people to jobs. I grew up in a rural part of the United States, and they have everything that you might want for an Indian village. We had amazing electricity, amazing schools, just everything that you might want. Very high agricultural productivity, and all of that. Every single person from my high school graduating class left. They left either they studied a bit more in the local college, and then they left after that, or they left right away after high school because there are just no opportunities in these rural areas. So I am skeptical that and that's not just Western Massachusetts. That's everywhere in the world. Every country that's gotten middle income, that's gotten rich, has done through massive movements of people across space and out of agriculture and out of rural areas. So I'm very skeptical that sort of infrastructure and other policies that are trying to encourage different types of jobs in rural areas are going to be successful. And I think the Indian experience and all of the policies that have tried to force non-farm firms to operate in rural areas have shown very limited returns. And finally, I just wanted to say on informality, again, kind of getting back to this point earlier of all these things the same? And my meta point about these are outcomes. They're often not inputs. Like informality is a decision that people are making. And certainly there are too many barriers to formalization of workers, to formalization of firms. But there's increasingly really good research around the world kind of suggesting that formalization may not have super high returns, and that when we're just looking in the cross-section and comparing formal and informal workers and seeing that they're much more productive in the formal sector, that's because of the types of workers that they are and not because of the sort of treatment effect of formality. And there's this great study in Brazil that I could point people towards who's, I forget the name of the author right now, Otero, I believe his name is. And they actually can shock people into becoming formal workers, and they find that for the average worker on the margin, they actually lose out from it, that the sort of penalty of being formal is higher than the benefits of being formal. And so again, I think it comes back to an educated and skilled workforce working in the kinds of locations that make them productive, and then a lot of the transition will happen from there towards the goals of this panel.
Great, thank you very much. We're above time, but we had a little bit of a transition. But it's obviously at the heart of the Indian sort of policy debate on some of the nostalgia for smallness, some of the nostalgia for informality. But it's sort of clear that we don't have enough big firms, and I hope we will. And that will be really important for wages. So thank you.